And my perspective on today's celebration is twofold. Firstly, as someone who's had a long interest in the concept of academic health science centres and the tripartite mission of research, teaching and clinical care, I see around me here at the Alfred, Suzanne and John's legacy. Because I think at the Alfred, on the Alfred site, there's a real demonstration of that vision, and especially in infectious diseases. The vision where we acknowledge that quality clinical care cannot occur without quality research underpinning it and quality teaching. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But my second perspective is a little different to most of the people in this room, because I think most of you sort of grew up together in the cauldron of Melbourne biomedicine. I dropped into the Alfred in 1999 from Adelaide. So a lot of the history that I've just heard, I've heard all those stories, but it's just great to hear them again. But I missed out on all of that, coming from Adelaide. And actually 1999 was an important year because the 2 years before that, the Crows won the grand final. So I felt pretty confident coming from Adelaide to Melbourne. But some significant things had happened, and we've heard about that. Fairfield had just closed, and the majority of Fairfield had moved to the Alfred. And I came across to lead the infectious diseases unit here at the Alfred. And Suzanne and John were critically important at that stage, really ensuring, again, that this large and highly talented infectious disease unit that we've heard about was underpinned by quality research. And again, I just emphasise the importance of that culture that came from Fairfield by having Fairfield and the Burnet together, the Infectious Diseases Hospital and the Research Centre at the same place. That underpinning of clinical service with research was incredibly important. And having both John and Suzanne on the staff of the Infectious Diseases Unit, bringing that culture, as did everyone else who moved from the Fairfield to Alfred, I think was very important, and important coming to a site at the Alfred that probably already had a bit of that culture, but not an enormous amount, and yet that we now see this AMREP site as being one of the exemplars in Australia of research underpinning clinical care. At the same time, and in parallel, they were organising the funding for the Burnet to move from Fairfield, organising and planning a building and designing that building to optimise its ability to underpin clinical care here at the Alfred with research. So about 5 years after Fairfield closed and had moved to the Alfred, the new Burnet building opened next door to the Baker, as it is now, and the three-legged stool was complete. The best ID service, the best teaching, and the best ID research. And the vision that Suzanne and John, I think, had when they were at Fairfield with the McFarlane Burnet Centre and the infectious diseases was now complete at the AMREP site. And I always think it's a little bit sad, actually, that John never moved into the building as director. John stepped down when the building was opened, and I took up the role as director of the Burnet Institute and moved from the Alfred ID service. But there's another twist there as well, because the ID service then needed a new leader. And looking around the world for that leader, a new leader was found who just happened to have been trained by John and Suzanne, and that was Sharon Lewin. And Sharon, who we'll hear from later, then took the ID unit from strength to strength. So there's a very clear circle there as well. As everyone in this room knows, the Australian response to HIV/AIDS was remarkable. It was a remarkable example of translational medicine. And to achieve that response needed to be national, and it needed to be underpinned by biomedicine. And Suzanne and John played a critical role in ensuring the biomedical strength of the Melbourne and national response and also a critical role in ensuring that Melbourne played such a big role in the national response. And it truly was a national response, but I think we'd be sort of wearing rose-coloured glasses if we didn't admit there was a bit of competition as well. And I think Sydney might have preferred it being a Sydney response. And I think it was really important that Melbourne stood up and played a really critical role in that response to HIV/AIDS. And it did, and really most of the biomedicine underpinning that response happened in Melbourne, in addition to significant clinical trials and clinical research that underpinned an enormous response from Australia. The other part of that response was Australia's international response, and obviously the Burnet, having built up a international health capacity, was able to respond at an international level as well, which was incredibly important and preceded the response that we also see from across the country, but also from Sydney. So that response was very important, and Suzanne also followed that up with her engagement with the Australia-India Council and the teaching and HIV education that occurred there. And I remember on one occasion, Suzanne asked me to go to India for a week and do some lecturing, and that was a fantastic experience, but also flawlessly organised, and I had a terrific time. There's one aspect of Suzanne that Teresa, my wife, particularly wanted to highlight, and that was her remarkable capacity to knit while being in the lecture theatre or at a lab talk or any meeting. Actually, could have been any of the meetings. And Suzanne would be there knitting away, and then the person would finish, and then she'd ask a really insightful question. So clearly concentrating on the talk, but it would be interesting to know how many garments Suzanne knitted through those meetings, but maybe she'll tell us later. And then the final legacy I want to discuss, and it was mentioned, was the formation of AMRI, the Australian Association for Medical Research Institutes. And I know John was the founding president, but I actually don't know exactly the history of how that was all formed in the back room somewhere, I presume, John. But again, I'd be really interested when you get your opportunity to talk, perhaps how AMRI was initiated. But AMRI now is a very powerful organisation. I think the peak lobby group in medical research in Australia, has achieved an awful lot. But one of the most important things that AMRI achieved was achieved when John formed it and was the first president, and that was the Independent Infrastructure Funding, IRIS, from NHMRC. And prior to that, you could almost argue that the independent medical research institutes, apart from WEHI of course, were economically not sustainable, almost not sustainable. They probably were sustainable, but then the acknowledgement by government, because of the arguments that John brought up, that infrastructure funding wasn't included into competitive research funding. So you could be the most competitive independent medical research institute, get as many NHMRC grants, but there'd still be this significant gap of funding that related to infrastructure. And John made that argument particularly strongly and for some time and persistently, and won the day with the IRIS funding from NHMRC, which gives 20% of infrastructure funding to independent medical research institutes. And that's been critically important for the survival and sustainability of medical research institutes all over the country. And I know, as Brendan has argued often as president of AMRI, the independent medical research institutes contribute enormously to Australian health and medical research. And I don't think we would be here. Places like SAMRI wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for that NCRIS funding. So I'd like to thank John for that. So in summary, I see here, particularly at the Alfred, the legacy of Suzanne and John. I see an ID service, an infectious diseases service, underpinned by research and teaching, co-located with a sustainable, independent infectious diseases medical research institute, and together having a significant impact of infectious diseases locally, nationally and internationally. Thank you, Suzanne and John.